Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. The day Olivia's world collapsed started like any other. She had just returned from a week-long business trip, exhausted but satisfied. The deal she had worked on for months had finally closed, and all she wanted was to kick off her heels, pour herself a glass of wine, and sink into the cozy comfort of her home. But as she pulled into the driveway, something felt wrong. The curtains in the windows were gone. The flower pots she had placed on the porch were missing. Even the familiar smell of her favorite lavender candles was absent. Then she saw it, a for sale sign still planted in the yard. Her breath hitched. For sale. That didn't make any sense. She and Daniel had no plans to move. They had built this life together, brick by brick. Heart pounding, Olivia rushed to the front door. She reached for her keys, only to realize the lock had been changed. She pounded on the door, panic clawing at her throat. "Hello? Is anyone inside?" No answer. With shaking hands, she pulled out her phone and called Daniel. Straight to voicemail. Again, and again, and again. Something was very, very wrong. She ran around to the backyard, searching for any sign that this was some sort of mistake. But as she peeked through the back window, her stomach twisted into knots. Everything was gone. The couch where she and Daniel had cuddled on rainy nights. The bookshelves filled with her favorite novels. The framed wedding photos. The paintings. The plants. All of it. The walls were bare. The floors empty, like they had never lived there at all. A cold, sinking realization settled over her. Daniel had done this. And just like that, the man she loved had vanished. The search begins. The days that followed were a blur of disbelief, anger, and confusion. The bank accounts, drained. Her jewelry, the expensive watch she gifted him for their anniversary. Their joint savings, the money they had been putting away for their future, wiped out. Daniel had taken everything and disappeared without a trace. Olivia filed a police report, but the officers shrugged. "He's your husband. Maybe he just left. Marital disputes aren't a crime. Technically, if he was on the deed, he had the legal right to sell the house. Legal right. Legal right." She had been working late nights, traveling for work, sacrificing everything to build their future, and he had the legal right to destroy it. Fury boiled in her veins. Fine. If the police wouldn't help, she would find him herself. For 2 years, Olivia searched. She hired private investigators. She traced bank transactions. She followed every rumor, every whisper of a man matching his description. But Daniel was a ghost. The trail would warm for a moment. A sighting in another city, a credit card charge in a different state, only to go cold again. And then, just when she thought she would never find him, a phone call changed everything. It was a crisp autumn morning when Olivia's phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but something told her to answer. "Hello." A hesitant voice on the other end. "Olivia. It's Mrs. Carter. Daniel's mother." Olivia's grip tightened on the phone. Daniel's mother. She hadn't heard from her since the day he vanished. Mrs. Carter's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I thought you should know. Daniel's coming home. He's visiting us this weekend." For a moment, Olivia forgot how to breathe. Daniel. After 2 years. 2 years of searching. 2 years of betrayal. He was finally coming out of hiding. "I just thought you should know," his mother continued, guilt laced in her voice. "I know what he did to you, Olivia. And, well, I think it's time he faces it." The line went dead. Olivia stood there, gripping her phone, her heart pounding so loud she could barely think. She had spent 2 years chasing shadows. 2 years rebuilding the pieces of her shattered life. And now it was his turn to run. When Olivia pulled into the Carter family's driveway, the house felt eerily familiar. She had spent countless weekends here, sharing family dinners, playing cards with Daniel's father, drinking coffee with his mother. But tonight, she wasn't here as a daughter-in-law. She was here for justice. She stepped out of the car and adjusted her coat, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She wasn't the same woman Daniel had abandoned. And as she reached the front steps, the door creaked open. Mrs. Carter stood there, worry etched into her face. "Olivia, I know," Olivia cut in gently. "I'm not here for you. I just want to talk to him." Mrs. Carter hesitated, then stepped aside. The living room was warm, filled with the scent of old wood and cinnamon. And sitting on the couch, looking far too comfortable, was Daniel. He didn't see her at first. He was laughing at something his father said, holding a beer like he hadn't ruined her life. Then his eyes lifted, and he froze. The blood drained from his face. His grip on the bottle tightened. "Olivia!" She tilted her head, a slow smile curling on her lips. "Surprised to see me." His throat bobbed. How did you find you?" She stepped closer, enjoying the way he tensed. "Oh, you didn't think you could just walk back into your parents' house like nothing happened, did you?" His father looked between them, confused. "Son, what is she talking about?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked trapped, like a rat cornered in an alley. And Olivia, she wasn't going to let him escape this time. But before Daniel could even attempt to explain himself, Mrs. Carter let out a nervous cough. "Maybe," she said carefully, "we should all sit down. Because, Daniel, there's something you don't know either." The room fell silent. And Olivia, she already knew what Mrs. Carter was about to say. Because this time she was the one who had the upper hand. Daniel's hands trembled as he placed the beer bottle down, his eyes darting between his mother and Olivia. He swallowed hard, his voice hoarse when he finally spoke. "What do you mean, something I don't know?" Mrs. Carter hesitated, glancing at Olivia before exhaling a deep sigh. "Sit down, Daniel." But he didn't sit. His entire body was tense, like he was ready to bolt at any second. Olivia watched him closely, her heart pounding, but her face betrayed nothing. She had waited 2 years for this moment. She wasn't going to let him slip away now. His father leaned forward, his wrinkled hands clasped together. "Son, you know when Grandpa Carter passed, he left the house to someone, right?" Daniel let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Yeah, to Dad. And you sold it, just like you planned to." Silence. A long, heavy, suffocating silence. Mrs. Carter shook her head. "No, Daniel. We didn't sell the house." Daniel frowned, his brows furrowing. "What are you talking about?" Olivia took a step closer, her voice calm, steady, sharp as a blade. "They didn't sell the house because it wasn't theirs to sell." His gaze snapped back to her, confusion flickering behind his panic. "That doesn't make any sense. My grandfather left the house to my father. It was his to do whatever he wanted with it. And we, Olivia cut him off. "You mean you sold it?" She let out a soft laugh. "That's what you thought, isn't it? That you had the right to sell the house while I was away. Take the money, disappear, and never look back." Daniel's face paled. I was on the deed. We both were." "Yes, but you never read the fine print, did you?" Olivia's voice was laced with amusement now, the kind that made Daniel's stomach twist. "Grandpa Carter left that house to someone specific. Not to your father, not to your family, to someone he trusted. Someone who actually took care of him in his final years." Daniel shook his head, trying to grasp at any explanation that made sense. "No, that's not possible. It was always going to stay in the family. My grandfather wouldn't have." "He did," Mrs. Carter interjected softly. Daniel turned to his mother, desperation creeping into his voice. "Mom, what are you saying?" She hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. Then she looked at Olivia. "She already knows, Daniel." Daniel blinked, his lips parted then shut. His breathing became erratic, and Olivia saw the exact moment realization struck him. His head snapped back toward her. "No," She tilted her head, a slow smile curling at the edges of her lips. Yes. His hands clenched into fists. You're lying. Am I? Olivia crossed her arms. You thought you were stealing from me, Daniel. But the truth is, you sold a house that was never yours to sell. Mrs. Carter's voice was barely above a whisper. Grandpa left the house to Olivia. The air in the room shifted. Daniel swayed slightly where he stood, his face frozen in shock. No, he repeated, but this time it came out weaker. Yes, Olivia said again, her voice firm. Grandpa Carter changed his will before he passed. He left it to me because I was the only one who actually cared for him in his final days. She took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough that Daniel could feel the weight of every single word. He saw what kind of man you were, and he made sure you'd never get your hands on what wasn't yours. Daniel stumbled back, running a hand through his hair like he could erase reality with enough pressure. That's impossible. Olivia let out a soft chuckle. Is it? Then why do you think your father never sold it? She gestured to his parents. They knew the truth all along. They knew what you did. And they knew there was nothing they could do about it. Daniel turned to his father, looking for some kind of denial, some kind of reassurance that this wasn't real. But his father just sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. You messed up, son. The words hit Daniel like a blow. I don't. He let out a short, breathless laugh, shaking his head violently. I don't understand. I sold it. The sale went through. The money. Olivia's lips curled. You really think I was going to let you get away with it? She reached into her purse and pulled out a single sheet of paper. She unfolded it carefully and placed it on the coffee table in front of him. Daniel's breath hitched as his eyes scanned the page. A legal document. Court ruling. His voice was barely a whisper when he spoke again. This says the sale was voided. Olivia nodded. Turns out, when someone illegally sells property that doesn't belong to them, it tends to get reversed. The new buyers got their money back. Got my house back. And you? Well, she gestured around the room, letting the realization settle in. Daniel swayed where he stood. No, that's not. You stole from me, Daniel. You took everything you could, thinking I'd be left with nothing. Olivia leaned in slightly, her voice dangerously low. But in the end, I got everything back. His face twisted, fury flashing in his eyes. You ruined me. Olivia tilted her head, feigning curiosity. Did I? Or did you do that all on your own? Daniel's breathing was ragged. He looked like a man drowning, grasping for something, anything to keep him afloat. But there was nothing left to hold on to. His mother wiped at her eyes. Oh, Daniel, she whispered, shaking her head. What did you do to yourself? His father sighed heavily. You brought this on yourself, son. Daniel's knees buckled slightly, and for the first time, Olivia saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen in years. Fear. Pure, unfiltered fear. She straightened her posture, smoothing out her coat as she turned toward the door. I didn't come here to fight, Daniel, she said, her voice lighter now, almost amused. I just thought you should know the truth. And now you do. She turned to his parents, nodding politely. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, thank you for the hospitality. I'll be leaving now. She took a step forward, but then, just as she reached the door, she paused. She turned her head slightly, just enough to glance back at Daniel over her shoulder. Oh, she murmured, as if remembering something. And one more thing. Daniel barely looked at her. His head hung low. I hope you didn't waste all that money you stole from me. She smiled. Because you're going to need it for your legal fees. And with that, she walked out, the sound of her heels echoing through the silent house. Daniel didn't move. He didn't breathe, because for the first time in his life, he had lost everything. Olivia walked down the front steps of the Carter house, her heart pounding with adrenaline. The crisp night air filled her lungs, cooling the fire that had burned inside her for 2 years. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, seeing Daniel's face as he realized he had lost everything. But now that it had happened, a strange calm settled over her. It was over. Almost. She reached her car, gripping the handle before pausing for a moment. There was one last thing to take care of. Sliding into the driver's seat, she pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she had been saving for this exact moment. She pressed call. A deep voice answered on the third ring. "Ms. Carter." She smiled. "Mr. Hayes. I just had a very enlightening conversation with my ex-husband." There was a brief chuckle on the other end. "I assume he finally realized what he did." "Oh, he realized," she said, her voice smooth. "And I think it's time we move on to the next step." Then, understood. "I'll handle everything from here." She ended the call and set the phone down beside her, gripping the steering wheel. She knew exactly where she was going next. Daniel's home. The home he had stolen. The home that had never belonged to him. Her home. As she drove through the quiet streets, her mind wandered back to the past 2 years. The nights spent wondering how he could do this to her. The moments of doubt, of rage, of exhaustion. The battles with lawyers. The endless fights to reclaim what was hers. And now she had it all. She pulled up in front of the house, stepping out of the car with an eerie sense of déjà vu. The last time she stood here, she had been desperate. Broken. Not anymore. Unlocking the front door, she stepped inside. The house had been restored to exactly how she left it before Daniel ripped it away. The scent of fresh lavender filled the air. She had made sure of it. She moved through the halls, fingers grazing the walls. Everything was back in its place. The furniture, photos, the life that had been stolen. As she reached the kitchen, she poured herself a glass of wine, savoring the taste of victory. Then she reached for her laptop and opened her email. A single message waited in her inbox. From Hayes. Subject: Final proceedings. She clicked it open. "Ms. Carter, the charges have been officially filed. He will be served within 24 hours. Rest assured this time he won't be able to run. Regards, Maze." A slow, satisfied smile stretched across her lips. Daniel had sold the house. He had stolen from her, disappeared, and lived his life thinking he had won. But he had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated her. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She set down her glass and walked toward the entryway, peering through the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood on the porch, a thick envelope in hand. Papers. She took a deep breath before opening the door. "Ms. Carter?" the man asked. She nodded. He handed her the envelope. "Everything is in motion. He'll receive his tomorrow morning." She took the papers, flipping through them briefly. Charges of fraud. Of illegal property transfer. It was all there. The man gave a polite nod before turning to leave, and Olivia shut the door, leaning against it for a brief moment. It was done. Daniel's life was about to crumble, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The next morning, as the sun spilled through the windows of her home, Olivia brewed herself a cup of coffee and turned on the news. She didn't have to wait long. The headline scrolled across the screen in bold letters. "Local man arrested for fraudulent property sale. Victim speaks out." A grainy video played, showing Daniel being led out of his parents' house in handcuffs. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. His parents stood on the porch, their expressions unreadable. Olivia took a slow sip of her coffee, exhaling in satisfaction. Daniel had walked away thinking he had won. But in the end, she had taken everything back. And now, as she watched him being shoved into the back of a police car, she smiled. Because justice had finally been served. End. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story and tell us where you're watching from.